This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by Returning to Eden, a field guide for the spiritual journey. Returning to Eden is a book by Heather Hamilton for people who resonate with aspects of Christianity but struggle with the coherence of its claims. You can purchase Returning to Eden by Heather Hamilton at Amazon.com or at returningtoeden.com.
The majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation. We could actually change as a people.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
That can't be the gospel because God said to love our neighbors.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
Just to begin questioning is so difficult because you have these voices in your ears telling you that you're not a real Christian.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
Welcome back to the Liminal Living podcast. This is your third appearance with us, and I'm glad to see your face again. How you doing?
Doing well. It's a hat trick. I like talking with you.
Oh, I haven't heard that term in a long time. I haven't followed hockey in a while. Yeah, third time's a charm. Now, have you been on any cool hikes lately? I've been seeing some really cool pictures on your Facebook page.
Yeah, I get out and hike as much as I can, usually about every weekend, although I've been doing a lot of traveling and speaking lately and doing less. But I got actually news to share. It'll probably come out next year. I'm doing a film on God, nature, and photography, in which I'm both the videographer and the photographer. It features stills of my nature photographs. So when that comes out, I'll send you a link.
That sounds really cool. That's really cool.
I think it will be.
Now, is it going to be a documentary of like any of the theologies you've been working on mixed in with your photography?
Yeah, that's kind of what it is. Yeah, it's like I talk about various spiritualities that I think about and experience on my hikes, and I go through about a dozen of them, and I talk a little bit about my own deconstruction, and I actually have a literal cave that I go to sometimes, but I'm kind of using my still photography as examples of kinds of spiritualities, like a spirituality of abundance, a spirituality of freedom, a spirituality of nakedness. I've got a little clip of me walking naked, so it's a PG-13 kind of a flick.
That'll be fun. Wow, that reminds me of Thomas Merton. He was not just a phenomenal, he was a poet. He was a theologian, he was a philosopher, he was a social justice warrior, but he was also a photographer.
That's right, Yeah,
so I've looked at some of his photography, and it's good stuff. And I love your photography. I don't know
Tom.
how you do it, but I always pause when I come to a photo that you've been doing, and I'll make it larger on my screen, and I'll just kind of take a moment and just take that in, because you're really good at photography.
Oh man, I'm happy to hear that you do that practice, because that's one of the main reasons I post my stuff.
It interrupts my doom scrolling.
That's right.
Yeah, well, that is very cool. I'll definitely have to have you back on when that comes about, because that sounds really interesting. It seems like you're able, you've done some deconstruction work, and then you help others in their deconstruction, and you're actually like training theologians and pastors and all this on a kind of reimagining God. And that's really why I wanted to have you on, because I've been having so many different conversations about the deconstruction journey, trying to understand it myself, because, I was walking through it and really getting specific on what am I deconstructing, why, what are its roots. And I feel like a lot of people really have connected with that for a long time. But then we're kind of left with this flat world where it's like there's no magic left.
Yeah.
There's no enchantment left. You really distrust your own experiences of any kind of not supernatural, but any kind of a God experience. You're very leery of trusting in it again, because it's like, well, I used to really, get sucked into that song and worship and tears are flowing. Then it turns out, it's just, my psychology and my emotions getting with the drum beat, and it was just a moment.
Yeah.
So you're able to like almost reduce it down to this materialist, naturalist world where there's no magic left. And then you distrust any experience of God. And I'm there. Like I am very leery of all things like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to put some of my world back together, my spiritual world back together, and really learn like, okay, how does this work? How does prayer work? And the movement of the Spirit and inspiration and all these different pieces. So that's what I've been trying to explore this fall with some people. And just the way you're able to capture your photography shows me like there's enchantment in this man's heart. So I wanted to talk to you about some stuff. So that's the reason.
I'm eager to do that.
Well, one of the things, how would you go about defining, there's like the materialist and supernatural divisions that we have lived with for a long time that don't seem to be holding up under the modern world as we understand it, that dichotomy. And it seems like a different worldview is going to be needed in order to support a Christian spirituality going forward. But we can't have that dichotomy of natural and supernatural. It doesn't seem to hold water anymore. Is there a different paradigm that you've found that might not be so polaristic and separated from the human experience that kind of helps be the new container as we go forward? Is there something that comes to mind?
Yeah, there's lots of things that come to mind.
Good.
I don't really like that word supernatural for a couple of reasons. One, I think as you were mentioning, supernatural has come to mean, in the minds of many, especially in the academy, supernatural has come to mean an interruption of the natural laws or the typical ways that nature works in the world. So some kind of intervention or interruption of those things. Or secondly, and closely related, the notion that God controls someone or something. And I don't like either of those connotations. I don't believe in a controlling God. I don't believe in interrupting and intervening God. Intervening sounds like God is coming into some place where God wasn't previous. So it's kind of an implicit denial of God's universal presence, or what in theology we often call God's omnipresence. So I don't like that language at all. I tend to, when I think about these issues, I start usually with my own experience. And part of that experience is that I am a choosing person. I make free choices, not unlimited freedom, but I have a measure of freedom in every moment. And I start with the notion that I'm a thinking person, that I have real thoughts. I'm not reduced to a machine in that way. And perhaps most importantly, at least in terms of what's usually neglected in religious circles, I think of myself as a feeling person. I'm a feeler. I feel not only emotions, but I feel in terms of the causal influences of the world around me. And given that kind of perspective, I think that opens up important ways of not only thinking about God's intimate activity in my life, but also what I share in common with other humans, other creatures, even the smallest entities of existence. Because I happen to think that they have a measure of mentality, agency, responsiveness, and feeling as well. So if you have that kind of a picture of us as creatures who have these capacities, and all other creatures in our world as having some measure of them, maybe not to the degree that we do, and then include a God who's always present, always acting, but never controlling, that's a radically different picture of God's relationship with us in the world than what most, at least in the Christian tradition, have suggested.
I like how you defined intervention there, because I grew up that's how I understood prayer to be. I'm constantly praying for God's intervention, and that means that God's not in that moment, not in the circumstance,
right,
not there at all, and I'm asking for God to then enter in and then make it better. And then when you get a couple of tragedies under your belt where it's like, oh, God didn't come in and rescue or intervene, and then all of a sudden you start thinking, well, what's wrong with me? It's like, is there something wrong with my faith? Is there something wrong with the way that I pray? Is there, there's other people seem to have testimonies that are, they're brought up front, and I was, I prayed and God cured me of cancer. I prayed and God rescued my loved one. And then you're kind of sitting there and it's like, well, how come that doesn't happen for me? And
right.
So
I call that the problem of selective miracles. People stand up and say, God did this for me. And you're sitting there thinking, well, I prayed too, and I still got the same problems.
Yeah.
And actually, there's another facet of those testimonies that I think is really misleading. And that is oftentimes, let's take a healing miracle, for instance. People will stand up and give a testimony, and their testimony will go something like this. I went to the doctor. The doctor tried to fix X problem in me. They couldn't. But God did it. And by that, they usually mean that God alone brought about the cure, the miracle, the positive thing. So it's that God was out there, intervened over here, and alone brought about some positive result. Well, if you got that view of divine action, then you've got the problem of selective miracles and lots of other problems of evil, because you're wondering, well, why doesn't this God come here and single-handedly fix this problem also?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, selective miracles, that is it. And you're constantly begging the universe for one of those selective miracles.
Yep.
It's like more oftentimes than not, it doesn't happen. And then you get real disenchanted with prayer and you're like, gosh, it doesn't even work. What's this even for?
Yeah, because people give you reasons why it didn't work. You got sin in your life, hidden sin, or, it's not a part of God's plan, or, you're somehow not good enough, or, whatever. Yeah, there's all kinds of excuses people give that in the end, I think, undermine trust in a loving God.
Yeah. And their excuses are to uphold their theology. It's like, well, I can't change my theology, and you're a problem to my theology, so I have to explain you away.
Right. Yep. And what they're assuming right out of the gate, and this is true of 90+% of people I know, at least in the Christian tradition, they are assuming God is omnipotent in the sense of being able to control anyone or anything at any time. And I am rejecting that idea.
Yeah, we talked about your book, The Death of Omnipotence, Birth of Omnipotence, and I had never even thought to question the omnipotence of God, because it's just built in to the God assumption that you're handed right off the bat. Even if you're not a Christian, it's built in to your God assumption. That's right.
Yes, most atheists I know think the God they don't believe in is omnipotent.
Yes. And here we're asking that omnipotent God to then come and intervene in an area that God must not be currently knowledgeable about or not present within.
Right.
And so we know that prayer isn't just asking for interventions from an omnipotent God and seeking, the benevolence of the Lord in the tower kind of a thing. That's a feudal understanding of God contextualized in the medieval world, I think.
Yeah.
God, we have the Lord in the tower, and sometimes he comes out to the tower and blesses us, but most of the time hangs out there, and we got to figure out where our bread's coming from. That's a very medieval understanding of God that we're still working with.
Right.
And I think we've developed as a human culture and race a little bit since then. But we're still working with that old medieval construct of God. And then how does prayer, I guess, how would you define prayer if it's not seeking the interventions of an omnipotent being to come and bless our life, step out of the tower and help us out down here? How would you define prayer? Just like a running definition, for a foundation.
Yeah. Maybe something like prayer is acknowledging the interactions with God and trying to cooperate with that God. And that can take a variety of forms, but it's sort of a way of being in the world that sometimes involves conscious words and sentences, but other times involves just my daily, mostly unconscious life, in which I'm trying to somehow cooperate with a spirit of love that I think is present in my life and in all of the world. I was thinking as you were talking, like this intervention idea is really problematic for the reasons we've just mentioned. But I could imagine someone, in fact, I know people like this, who don't have an interventionist God in the sense that God is somewhere out there and needs to come over here. They really believe God is with them at all times. So God, isn't intervening. But they retain that view of omnipotence, and they retain the view that God stands outside of time, like John Calvin thinks, and sees all of history all at once. If you have that view of God, it seems weird to pray at least a petitionary prayer, because usually people who think that God is omnipotent and stands outside of time also think that God knows with absolute certainty everything that's ever going to occur from this moment forward. And God can't make a mistake about that knowledge. And therefore, it seems like whatever is going to happen in the future, if God knows it to be true, must be settled, must be fixed, must be determined. But if that's the case, then interacting with a God believing that what we do might change the future, well, that's hopeless because the future is already determined. So there's a combination of ideas about God that lead, I think, to at least people who think about this carefully, to rejecting the need for prayer as a real activity that might affect God and affect the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because if you're constantly pleading with the universe for favor, but you have a theology that says that God knows all and has determined it. Even some Calvinists will say, well, God knows all potential possibilities that could happen, not just the ones that will be. Right. But if you make decision A or B, then God knows the trees that are going to branch out from those places and it's almost like a multiverse theology, like all understandings. But it still seems as though interventionary prayer or asking God for help or intervention is pointless, even in those cases, because God already knows everything that is going to happen, should happen, will happen. And then if bad things happen, then we have to write it off and say, well, God must know something that I don't, and therefore is allowing this and this to happen so that, better things can happen later. Instead of questioning the theology that gives us, we can't reimagine God. Therefore, we have to reimagine the narrative we're telling ourselves about how God must be intervening in our life.
Yep, that's right. Or we just walk away from God altogether. I mean,
that's also a valid, seen that as well. And just say, I can't find a narrative that makes this make sense. Therefore, I'm going to walk away. So I guess if we look at more of how the earlier Christians and Hebrew people, they didn't have that separation of supernatural and materialist world like we do. The word for spirit is the word for breath. And so it was a physical part of your body. as you're breathing in air, that's your vitality, that's your life, that's your spirit. Wind was spirit, so they had like these words that almost in like an indigenous way had a very creation centered.
Yes.
But then we have scientists now, in the modern day, they're trying to measure how much a soul weighs by, getting these micrometers and like how much down to the, 1/1,000,000th gram, how much lighter did the body get right after it died? And they can't find that piece, that physicality. And so I don't know what the paradigm is that kind of brings the spirit and the material together into one without dividing them up into two separate categories.
Yeah.
So we have the science that's trying to find things, measure things, understand things. And then the faith world says, well, you're never going to be able to find that because that's supernatural. That's spiritual, not physical. So you can't see it. Is spirit a part of the material world? If so, like, how do you think that works? Is it measurable? Does it have mass, weight, velocity, energy, those things?
Yeah. I think I want to answer that question kind of a roundabout way, if that's okay, Tom.
Sure.
Because you brought up scripture, and I think the vast majority of biblical writers assume what today we would call an animistic view of reality. And that's that enchantment that you've been mentioning. And they might use spirit as something that's not only in creatures, but also in, not only in humans, but in all creatures. That might be one way they talk about it. But there's some sort of animation, aliveness, enchantedness, spontaneity, some kind of deep life at play in reality, and not just human reality. Well, that lasted for quite a while in the Christian tradition. But the problem with an animated reality is that it's awfully hard to keep in check, control, and govern. And so when you get not only politicians involved in religion, especially the church, but also hierarchies within religious institutions in which we want to have some order, the notion of all creatures having some spontaneity and animation tends toward a kind of chaos that you can't control very well. So I think it was actually to the advantage of those who were aligned with folks in power to conceive of not only God, but existence in ways that might undermine or ignore that enchantedness that was so evident in the biblical witness. And then by the time we have the scientific revolution coming around, we see all kinds of amazing advances using the scientific method, which typically relies upon our five senses, especially sight, but to make sense of the world and to talk about experiments and things that can find results. And there's been amazing things that have happened using our five senses and this scientific method to structure our world in particular ways that have advantages toward us, also some major disadvantages. But, I want to acknowledge there's been some advantages because of the scientific revolution. But in the process of that, by the time the 20th century comes around, there's a pretty strong philosophical argument being made that the only thing we can really know is what can be tested empirically. So there was basically, this is called logical positivism. What we can really know is either what we can show by empirical method, which relies on our five senses, or what is logically true, mathematics, that sort of thing. Well, things like free will, feelings, emotions, thoughts, ideas, mental operations, none of those fit under the category of logical or empirically discernible by our five senses. Mm-hmm. And so much of what is valuable to our personal experience got set aside as either non-existent or at least not very important to what it means to know things. What I'm proposing is a reanimation or re-enchantment of reality that says that our knowledge relies upon more than our five senses. I call it non-sensory perception, that we all live our lives as if we have real knowledge of things that we can't actually see, taste, touch, whatever. And our lives can't even work if we don't assume that's reality. And if we go that direction, then not only do we make better sense of our lives, we make better sense of our planet and other creatures. And I think we have an actual plausible way to talk about God's action in our lives and in the world. Sorry for that long response, but
that I'd like to hear a little bit more about that last piece. Like how can you give an example of a non-sensory understanding of something? I want to understand that more.
Yeah. Well, one of them is you and I are having a conversation right now. We have thoughts going on in our heads. And that's having an influence on the words I'm choosing moment by moment, how I'm thinking about this situation. There's no senses that can test thoughts. You can't put a thought under a microscope or smell a thought or reach out and touch a thought. And yet we all assume that it has causal influence in our lives and in the world. Same with, free choices. Same with feelings. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like to live if you had no feelings whatsoever? In fact, they're so common in our lives that we just assume they're there. We don't even much think about them. But our five senses, they can't get access to those feelings. The feelings are deeper than touch, etc. So these inevitable realities of our lives we access through non-sensory perception, not any of our five senses.
I think philosophy helps us out in that realm because you can bring in the entire wing of philosophy called aesthetics, which is going to look at ethics in art.
Yes, another great example. Yeah.
And I saw somebody, I can't remember who posted it, but they kind of posted a triad that said there's theology, philosophy, and science. And this kind of makes up how we understand the reality, not just the world, but all of reality. And you can't have theology without having philosophy, and you also have to involve science in there. And it seems as though since, 1890s, 1920s in America, we're very reactionary against how science is expanding our understanding of the universe because it keeps calling into question the grounds that the church has held as authoritative. The world was made in 6,000 years. God did it in 6 days. And so that's how it works. God said it, and I believe it. And then science looks and says, well, actually, that's not how it happened. We have different understanding of things. And instead of expanding using philosophy and science to then bring our theology up to date with how things now we understand the world, we reject science and kind of create a very small metaphysic of the world and then demand everyone hop inside.
Right.
And we've been doing that about 100 years now, and I don't think it's working very good. So
no,
there's that triad. I think we need good theology, we need good philosophy, and we need good science. And those three things working together can help us understand the world a little bit better. How would you see enchantment fitting into that triad? Is that going to be more of the philosophical side, a theological side, a scientific side? How we see the world as animated and more than just a machine that's matter and just running without any intelligence to it whatsoever, no divine promptings or anything like that. How does enchantment fit there?
I suppose when it comes to enchantment, I start philosophically and think that that's going to probably inform theology and inform science, although obviously I think the other two affect philosophy. But the claim that the world is enchanted in the sense that creatures have a measure of mentality, freedom, they're experiencers, they have values like beauty, as you mentioned, but also emotions. those are the kinds of things that I think good theology will affirm, but probably in terms of making a case for that, I would want to start philosophically, because I think science, at least in its usual form, relies upon the five senses. I don't think science is going to give us proofs about those kinds of things, but I do think science can be improved if scientists assume the reality of those dimensions, those enchanted dimensions of life. So I think, for me to answer your question, it would be probably philosophically is where I would start to in the process of insisting on those qualities that I'm saying are part of enchantment.
As you were talking, I remembered I taught philosophy to high schoolers for 2 years. And when I was diving in, how do I teach this? One of the things I found was that a lot of our science started in philosophy because philosophy starts with the question. And
That's
then
right.
you start to, gather a theory together, and then you take your philosophy to science, and then you apply the empirical method, scientific method, and then you prove. So a lot of our modern day science actually started in the realm of philosophy.
Well, yeah. And in fact, early on, it wasn't even called science. It was called natural philosophy. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. A PhD is actually a doctorate of philosophy.
Yeah.
We're taking a quick break here mid-show to let you know of an opportunity that Choir is offering. Are you deconstructing your faith? It's tough, believe me, I know, I've done it. But what if you didn't have to do it alone? Imagine having guides like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zahn, Paul Young, and more by your side to help. I know I would have loved that on my journey. Well, now you can. Head on over to choiracademy.com, link will be in the show notes, and register for their Square 2 class using the promo code LIMINAL, and you will get 10% off. This course and community are designed to help you navigate your journey with wisdom and support, all because you're a fan of the Liminal Living podcast. Ministry leaders, how do you heal from the burnout, loneliness, and the relentless weight of leadership? Kaneo Center exists for you. For 5 years, Kaneo has walked with over 500 ministry leaders through their darkest seasons, offering a rare blend of compassionate coaching, therapeutically informed practices, and Jesus-centered renewal. Kaneo is launching new 24-week cohorts now, where you'll join a small group of leaders for weekly video coaching, guided curriculum, and reflections to rebuild your resilience. The cohort all ends with a retreat in Puerto Rico. As a Kaneo coach myself, I've seen how this space transforms lives. And for Liminal Living listeners, mention Liminal in your application at thecaneocenter.com/cohort to claim $100 off your cohort experience. You've poured into others, let Kaneo pour into you. If you're in a dark night or deconstruction, you know how vital it is to ground yourself in intentional practice. That's why I'm thrilled to partner with the Monk Manual, a journaling system inspired by monastic wisdom and backed by science. The Monk Manual is a daily journal companion for reflection, purpose, and aligning your actions with your deepest values. Whether you're rebuilding after deconstruction or seeking clarity in transition, this tool turns liminality into grounded growth. And now, Liminal Living listeners can save 10% on their Monk Manual using the code LIMINAL over at monkmanual.com/liminal. And remember, the wisdom of liminal spaces lies in how we journey through them. So do it with intention. And now back to our show.
I think all of this matters when it comes to prayer. Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to prayer, the most help, the most advance we can get is if we rethink our doctrine of God. Let me compare two models of God and the import of the second model when we think about what it means for prayer actually mattering, right? So the first model of God, I'll call it the God of Augustine and classical theism. This God is outside of time, is immutable and impassible, which means can't be affected by anything we do and will have no change of mind. This God is omnipotent, so could control anything God wanted to do, and at least in some forms of Augustine, and God predestined absolutely everything that ever goes on. So outside of time, unmoved or unrelated, omnipotent and predestining. If that's your view of God, I can't understand why you might get motivated to pray a petitionary prayer. At least I can't. Maybe someone else can. Actually, I have friends who have that view of God, and they would say they pray because they're trying to obey God. It's not because it makes sense to them. It's out of obedience. But the God who's outside of time and foreknows everything, it sounds like the future is settled for that God, especially if that God predestined everything. And even if God didn't, God's omnipotent. God could fix whatever you're asking God to fix, even if you never ask it. And if God is not relational, God's not going to be affected by anything you do anyway, which prayer is something you do. Right?
Yeah.
So that classic notion of God shouldn't motivate people to pray. Now, here's the alternative, and the one I affirm. First of all, I think God is relational. That means whatever I do, and prayer is an action, it's going to have some effect upon God. Secondly, I think God moves through time, moment by moment. That means that what I do in one moment, say pray, actually will have an effect upon God's experience in that moment, and God might act differently in the next moment because I prayed in the previous moment. So this notion of God in time matters for prayer. And I think God is not omnipotent. So my prayers about God fixing things unilaterally, those aren't going to ever happen because God can't fix them. However, I do think God exerts influence, and God takes up into God's self, moment by moment, everything that happened, and that can present new possibilities or opportunities in the future as God interacts with me in creation. So we got this God who's affected by me moment by moment, moving through time, taking up everything that happens, using that to interact in the next moment, and a God who's not omnipotent, and so actually needs our cooperation for love to win in its fullest. That's a view of a God, I think, that can cohere with a notion of prayer.
That I got an image in my head of kind of like a tree. A tree grows, and it's very like faithful. It's very steady. It's going to grow, and it's going to get bigger, but it takes a lot of time. And if God is more thinking the long game, and we're thinking more of like microwave. I need an answer to prayer. I need it now. And I'll throw it in 1 minute. I got a hot meal out of the microwave. Like God, we're thinking microwave prayers, and God's more like we're planting a forest here. It's going to take time. This is going to take cultivation. This is going to take partnership. That understanding of prayer seems more in line with the God of the Bible than that quick come and rescue, come and save, come and fix kind of a understanding of God. So I really like how you painted that picture. That it might be more of the long game. It might not be that interventionist kind of a understanding of God in prayer.
Yeah, I like that. I think the only thing I would tweak on that, and I think not even tweaking it, it's I would supplement. I would say it's not that God chooses to play the long game, as if God could fix things single-handedly right now and is just deciding not to. I think it's God's nature to be loving in an uncontrolling kind of way. So, yeah, I would just
like
want
that distinction. Yeah, the supplementation. And actually, that I like that because it's not that God is kind of saying, well, I could snap my fingers and genie this whole thing, but we'll just do this long game thing instead. But it's the very nature of God to be the long game.
Right.
I like that. That's an important distinction. So I was talking with my friend Paul, and he said, you talked to Thomas Oord lately? And I said, no, but I'm actually talking with him on Tuesday. And he was like,
good.
Oh. So he had a kind of a question that fit into this. And he was like, I'd like to know kind of how his understanding of the resurrection. And if we have that God who comes in and intervenes, a lot of the theologies behind resurrection is like that vindication moment that Christ has been vindicated. God was proven true. And So there's a lot of vindication speak wrapped up in the theology of the resurrection. And it almost feels like an intervention, like Christ was going to, Christ died on the cross, and then God came in and answered the prayer that Christ was praying on the cross, prayed in the garden. And then resurrection happened because God came in and supernaturally intervened and brought him back to life. How would you understand that whole resurrection narrative in this understanding of open and relational and prayer, that theology behind this?
I've written a chapter in a book on this particular subject, so I'm going to try to summarize that here. Nice. But I might send you that chapter after we're done so you can see the details.
You got to sell the book too. What book is it?
It's a book of a collection of essays, so it's a bunch of people contributing. It's something like Wesleyan Christology or something like that, or Methodist Christology. I can't remember the title off the top of my head. But like I said, I'd happily send you my own particular essay in that book. Let me start by saying the Bible does not give us any indication about how God resurrected Jesus. I think you're right that most people have assumed that God resurrected Jesus in some kind of supernatural, interventionist, controlling kind of way. Bible doesn't say that explicitly. So we're open, I think, biblically speaking, to speculate amongst possibilities. And when we speculate, I think we have to ask questions like, okay, what do we have in the text? And what are the implications for our model of God's resurrection for other questions we care about? And we've already mentioned that, some of the questions we care about are the problem of evil. And if God can resurrect single-handedly Jesus through some omnipotent power move, then you're going to wonder why God doesn't fix all kinds of other problems in our life and in the world. So we've already got some reasons to wonder if that traditional model is going to be up to the task. Then secondly, I think we have to ask the questions, again, what the text seems to be saying. And the text is weird. Let's just be honest about it. The text really is very, very weird. For instance, there's some things that are, I think, particularly odd if you think God single-handedly, omnipotently resurrected Jesus. One of them is that in Matthew's gospel, an angel has to go and roll away the stone. Now, you think that a God who has the kind of power to single-handedly resurrect a guy named Jesus wouldn't have to call upon somebody else to move a stone out of the way. That seemed like chump sort of thing. But there in the text, you got that happening. You wonder what's going on. Secondly, all of these post-resurrection sightings, there's some weird stuff. The earliest recorded sightings of Jesus aren't of a body. The earliest recorded sightings are Paul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. He sees a light and hears a voice, but there's nothing about an actual bodily Jesus there. And by earliest, in terms of the biblical record. Paul's writings come prior to the gospel writings in terms of their historicity. So the earliest account we have is not of a bodily resurrection. At least it's not explicit as a bodily resurrection. And then those accounts we have in the Gospels of people seeing Jesus are weird as all get out. For instance, one account, people go up, open the tomb, they think the gardener is standing there, and it turns out to be Jesus. Some think he's an angel. There's one account of two guys walking on the road to Emmaus with him, and they're clueless about who he is until he breaks bread. So whatever kind of body this is that comes out, it's one strange body. It's a body that apparently can go right through walls when the doors are locked and to see the disciples. And it's a body that somehow has wounds that you can put your fingers in. So it's hard to, I'm going to make a stronger case. It's impossible, I think, to come up with a consistent and coherent resurrection account that takes all of that stuff at face value. I think you have to ask questions about whether or not these sightings give us a flat historical account of what's happening, or if there's some real, I'll call it reinterpretations or imaginations of what's going on. At the end of the day, then, I think God really does resurrect Jesus, and that God resurrects you and me. But I'm not committed to the same body of Jesus coming out of that tomb that went in. I am committed to life after death, and I think Jesus is the first fruits of that kind of life after death experience. But exactly what kind of body Jesus has, I'm really not sure. I highly doubt it's the exact same body that went into the tomb.
So
how's that for rambling again? Sorry.
That's what I was looking for. I want lots of thoughts around this because you're helping me think through it.
Okay.
And there are some weird accounts, like that one in, I can't remember, his 1st or 2nd Corinthians, where Paul is saying, well, he was seen by this guy, and then there's 500 people at this one time that saw him. And it's like, but yeah, Paul never actually did see him. It was just the light and the voice.
Yeah.
And that's always been really interesting, like a little bit confusing for me.
Yeah.
That, because it seems as though each writer of the gospel is doing a specific thing with the same story. So there's this historical moment of resurrection, but they all take it in their own direction for their own purposes, doing their own theological work with it that the other ones don't even try to do. And then to try and synthesize them all together is impossible because they're all headed in different directions from that central point. And but if we understand the resurrection is not God intervening in some supernatural way to, rescue Jesus from the snares of death, then I guess what role did God play in the resurrection if it wasn't an intervention? Let me rescue you from, Sheol or Hades or wherever Jesus was at in that moment. How would we understand the action of God in the resurrection if it's open and relational?
Yeah. Well, at least my version of open and relational would say that God's interaction was persuasive in the sense of influential but not controlling. And since I think God is a universal spirit, we wouldn't be able to actually look in and see God fiddling with Jesus's body because we wouldn't be able to see God. And plus, this God would be omnipresent to Jesus's body. But the part of the equation that fits in here with our discussion of enchantedness is to also acknowledge that Jesus's mind and body continue to have some mentality, agency, freedom, whatever, even after being in the tomb, roughly 36 hours after he probably was taken off the cross, maybe a little less than that when you do the math. But anyway, it's not like there's nothing there. There's something there. And especially if you're someone like me who think that we have real minds, we'd have to ask the question, does Jesus have a mind and can that cooperate with God? And you'd think that someone who, like Jesus, who apparently was cooperating pretty consistently, if not perfectly, his entire life, that would be a major advantage in God's work to resurrect him. So you got a lot of positive things going there in terms of the cooperation of God with cooperation of Jesus with God's resurrection. And then this might strike you and your listeners as really weird too, but I'll put it out there. I think we have to ask questions about life after death and seek other sources. And so for me, the near-death experience literature and the out-of-body experience literature doesn't prove life after death, but I bring it in as support for the possibility. And so that's part of my equation here.
I've actually been diving into that same literature.
Good. Yeah.
The place that I found that's actually academically studying that is out of Virginia, the Department of Perceptual Studies, DOPS.
Oh, nice.
And it's they're trying to collect all of the narratives of these things and then do databases of out of body and near death experiences and actual death experiences to try and scientifically and academically kind of probe that. And so I've been trying to look at that things. And I think one of my biggest problems is I'm still operating with that dualistic mind of natural, supernatural.
Yeah.
And I say, well, how do we, then enchant the world? And I'm using my materialist scientific mind to try and do that.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, tell me how that works. Let's draw lines around that. What is it saying and what is it not saying? And empirically, how does it work? And so I'm still in the old mindset, trying to get a new mindset because I don't trust the new mindset yet.
Yeah.
Because I've deconstructed that whole dualistic. I know that that's not how it is, but I'm still using that as the framework to ask my questions moving forward.
Yeah.
And I haven't gotten there yet. So I think that's where a lot of my confusion comes.
Yeah. A couple of books I might recommend from the open and relational community on this issue. One by a guy named Ian Todd, who's a UK scientist who wrote a more accessible book that really delves a lot into the life or near-death experience literature, and then brings in open and relational theology as a way to account for it. And then the other one is from a guy named David Ray Griffin, who's more of a philosopher and theologian. And he's written about this in various books, but one that came out just a few years ago is on Alfred North Whitehead and William James and their views of life after death. And he brings in some near-death experiences, but here it's more philosophical from an open and relational perspective. So 2 different books, but on the same subject.
Yeah. I do a lot of funerals, so I'm around death quite a bit. I'm just kind of plan A for our local funeral home, and they have 6 different sites. So I find myself doing many funerals, I guess a month. I'll do sometimes one a week. I guess my record at this point was 3 in 1 week.
Wow.
But I do a lot of that, so I'm around that a lot, and it gets me questioning. Like, I wonder what it is like to walk through that whole process of when you breathe your last. Like, what does your consciousness experience? What does it look like, feel like? And then what is it on the other side of that? It's like that great mystery.
Yeah.
And so what do you think happens when you die? Like, what, but not just theologically, but actually like experientially, what do you think might happen?
Well, I do believe in what philosophers would call continued subjective experience beyond bodily death. I suspect that has primarily to do with our minds continuing on after our bodies and brains have began the decomposing process. And obviously, this is wild speculation, so I want to make sure I start with that.
Yeah.
But then I say to myself, okay, if our minds continue on, where do they go? And what is it about that afterlife experience? What characterizes it, especially what characterizes it in positive ways, since so many people talk about not only positive near-death experiences, but the Christian tradition has talked about going where there's no more death and no more pain, and etc. Well, I don't think we become omnipresent, and I also don't think we sort of disappear into God, because then we wouldn't really have subjective experiences. So I suspect we stay as a localized mind somewhere, in the world here, I suppose. Maybe we have the possibility to go on other planets, but I doubt we somehow can move at light speed in the afterlife. So I think one of the big advantages of that existence is you don't have to deal with the aches and pains of this body. And, you and I are getting older and we're experiencing more of them. And sometimes it's not just getting old that you get those kinds of pains. Sometimes people abuse you accidentally or on purpose. So there's going to be some real advantages to a life without bodies in that kind of state. And then maybe I'll finally say, if this is true, that we continue to have subjective experiences beyond bodily death, and we don't have to feel the pain of our bodies and many of those things associated with it, but we aren't omnipresent and we're located somewhere, maybe this supports a lot of not only biblical claims, but especially claims in indigenous religions that the ancestors tend to collect themselves or tend to be at particular sites and places. And your best chance of getting insights from the ancestors is to go to this mountain, that rock, that clearing, something like that. So wild speculation, but there you go.
That's all we got really until it happens.
Yeah.
But I like that because it does synthesize it with the natural world.
Yes. Yes.
This mountain contains, and a lot of Celtics will believe that, that stone has memory, not necessarily consciousness, but it remembers. And there's even a scientific theory about haunted places that is called the stone tape theory, that it was such a dramatic moment emotionally or whatnot that the energy of the moment gets caught on repeat. So it's a non-intelligence and it's just a repeating of a historical event in some energetic fashion over and over again. It's called the stone tape theory. So it's like my brain trying to make scientific something that might not ever be. But we can understand that there's spectrums of light that we can't see.
Sure.
There's something called dark matter and dark energy that somehow holds the universe together that we don't even know what it is.
Right.
So there's a lot of things in the unseen realm that is scientific, and part of me wonders if we'll figure that out one day. I don't know.
Yeah. I can't help also to go back to the philosophy side of things and mention that today there's a growing number of philosophers and theologians and others who embrace a view called panpsychism or pan-experientialism. The language
is throughout everything?
Yeah, something like that. My preferred label is material mental monism. And I like that label because it says that everything that exists has both a mental and a material dimension. And it's not the kind of dualism in which we have a mind that's mental and a body that's material, but everything, including minds and including God, has mental and material dimensions. And that can account for the kinds of claims you're making about rocks and other things in the world having some measure of mentality, even if it's infinitesimally smaller than what you and I have. There's something still there.
Yeah. Yeah, I've adopted a saying. I say it at a lot of funeral services where I use a John O'Donohue quote about how our loved ones, they're not gone. They're an invisible presence that stay with us after we've lost them. And I say this saying after I do that. I said, I don't know how it works. I just know that it's true. And then I'll give some experiences of how I think I've experienced my own father from beyond the grave. I said, how is he able to see me, interact with me, send messages through? It's like, I don't know how it works. I just know that my dad's presence somehow is with me and guides me along my path. Yeah. And I've experienced it in magical ways and not so magical ways here and there. And John O'Donohue says in that same quote, part of the healing of grief is learning how to see and sense their loving nearness. And again, I don't know how it works. I just know that it is true. And so I just kind of adopted that as that's my way forward, because I don't know how to trust my experiences of things that I would have labeled supernatural previously. But I also don't want to just reduce it to a materialistic, mechanical, dead, no spirit in it kind of a thing.
Yeah, so I like that.
That's my phrase to help me learn a little bit more humility, cosmologically, philosophically, theologically. Do you think that there's some things that we can do to kind of reestablish trust in the, I guess, spirit, whatever we want to label that, not using the word supernatural, but in those experiences of God, the immanence of God, maybe?
Yeah, maybe I'll point to two things. One of them theological, one of them more our frameworks for thinking about God in our experience. The theological one is, I think we can learn to trust God Sorry if I'm sounding like I'm repeating myself, but I think we can learn to trust God if we're committed to the notion that God is perfectly, always, consistently loving. And by loving, I mean acting for our well-being and the well-being of all. God always wants flourishing. And God can't control anyone or anything. Those two things together provide me a great deal of comfort, confidence, and trust. If God can control and doesn't stop evil, then I don't trust that God. If God isn't all loving, I'm not going to trust that God. But a God who's all loving but can't control, that sounds like a trustworthy agent. And then in terms of kind of the conceptual thing, something that helps me helps me to trust is my belief that because God is uncontrolling, everything that happens in our lives and in creation has both divine and creaturely influence. And sometimes the divine influence is largely ignored by creatures, and therefore we have evil things that happen. But oftentimes God's influence is also misunderstood by creatures. And so that means that if we look back on our previous lives and recount powerful spiritual experiences, maybe at church camp, in the woods, in a worship service and prayer, and in our former lives, we had defined those as some supernatural intervention, and now we don't believe in that. We don't have to throw out belief that God was active in that moment. We just have to reinterpret that divine action in ways that better fit our current ways of thinking about God. So in doing that, we can reclaim or salvage those powerful past moments of spiritual experience without having to say, having to retain the theological frameworks we used back then to try to make sense of them.
Wow. My brain just did a little small explosion.
I love it, Tom.
Salvaging, almost like reimagining your past experiences with new frameworks.
Right.
Instead of just ditching it all together and say, "Oh, it was all bullshit." So
exactly.
No. Because in that moment, it meant something. In that moment, it did something. It's just the framework I used to interpret it was not necessarily fine-tuned.
Yep.
But it was still real. Well, you just blew my world. Holy cow.
I love it, Tom.
That was great. Well, gosh, we're hitting that 1 hour mark, and I want to honor your time. And I have appreciated this conversation. It's been,
I
just
enjoyed it
really
too.
good. Everything I was hoping it was, you hit it. So thank you so much. That was great. What do you got going on that you want to aim people towards? Projects, books, writings, speakings? Where should you send people?
Well, I think given this conversation, the recent book that I would like to emphasize people might check out is called God After Deconstruction. And in this book, Chip Fuller and I look at 8 reasons why people deconstruct. We think that all 8 of them are legitimate reasons. And then we say, but there's a different way to think about God. And this new way to think about God can help us incorporate that deconstruction and then reconstruct or re-enchant, to use the language we're using here. And it's written from an open and relational perspective. So if folks are interested in the kind of topics we've been exploring the last hour, that book, God After Deconstruction, would be great.
Okay. Well, I'll drop that down in the comments. That'll be great. Wow. Well, the Tom and Tom show was lit, as the kids say.
That's right. I love it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And I look forward to seeing some more photographs in the future.
All right. My pleasure, Tom.